Yes.
Well, just to start, thank you, Rick Doblin, for this interview with Reality Sandwich. We're here at the MAPS Multi-Disciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies 2010 Psychedelic Science Conference. Now, you were formed in 1986.
1986.
1986, yep.
Yeah.
It's been a while, but it really seems like there's Psychedelic Renaissance. It's really all the groundwork and the seeding that MAPS has done, and the support of individual researchers and scientists seems to have really reached a very public peak recently. How do you feel about the work MAPS has been doing in the last 20 plus years?
Well, I feel like we could have done it in 4 years if we didn't have to go through this incredible resistance, but we did. So I feel like tremendous. I mean, that we're at the end of the beginning of the Psychedelic Renaissance, and we're there in such a solid place where there are studies all over the world. There's pilot studies that are starting to come out with promising data. None of them have been accepted for publication, but they're under review. Our MDMA PTSD study from the United States, Charlie Grove's psilocybin cancer anxiety study, they're both nearing final stages of peer review process. So I feel like things are going to continue to build and gather momentum and get even stronger.
You were saying, obviously, you had a lot of blockage from government sources, and there's been maybe a top level cultural embargo or something against this type of research for the last 30, 40 years. But MAPS has been, the spearhead organisation has been chipping away at that.
Right.
But you've obviously encountered a lot of blockages. How have you been dealing with that on an ongoing basis?
By being incredibly patient. Because a lot of them you just can't get over. You have to go around, and it takes a long time sometimes. Like, for example, when MDMA was first criminalized in 1985, it took us 7 years before we could get permission for the first study where we administered MDMA to humans. And in between 85 and 92, we had about 5 different studies that were all rejected. So the key part has been redefining success. So if success were doing these studies, getting these drugs as prescription medicines, I would have been demoralized and depressed. But I was able to recognize that it's such a big picture that it's no one of us can really influence completely how it happens. And so I recognized that if I could just work hard at it and try to be happy because of that and satisfied, then I could deal with all these decades of making no progress or making little progress. So
why do you think there is progress now, though? Apart from all the government regulations, there seems to be a cultural shift happening in Western culture where they're embracing the idea of psychedelic medicines and of psychedelics themselves. It's almost like the culture is ready to integrate where it wasn't and was threatened by it 50 years ago.
Yeah, I think, one of the ways to say is that psychedelics bring us in touch with the death rebirth process, just raw human emotion, and that in the 50s and 60s when psychedelics were emerging, people didn't talk about death. My aunt died when she was 21 years old of cancer. This was in 1957, and my grandparents never even told her she had cancer because that was the idea. You can't even talk about it. The women who were giving birth, a lot of them were tranquilized, and it was highly medicalized thing. So over the last 40 years, the hospice movement, the first one was in 1974, and by 2004 there was 3,500. So we've taken death out of the shadows and gotten more comfortable with it. We've taken birth out of this heavily medicalized system, and then we've also integrated yoga, integrated meditation into our culture. And I think that there's been one of the benefits, you could say, of global warming is that people are more and more realizing that there are planetary systems, and they're looking at things from beyond their national borders. So there's this growing global spirituality of identification, and that's sort of causing the fundamentalists in the different areas to hold on even tighter. So one view of the world might be that there's, increasing fundamentalism. But if you look at the Catholic Church, the erosion of their credibility and authority because of the sexual abuse scandals, even the very, martyrdom-oriented, religions, that I think there's more of a need right now. There's more of a sense of desperation in a way. And there's also this reservoir of people who were young in the 60s who are who, for the most part, have abandoned psychedelics, abandoned drugs while they had their careers and their families, and they've had to do drug testing. Now they're coming back.
Do you think they're coming back in a recognizable way, the elders? And that's what we need, that bridge between the generations.
I do think so. Particularly as they are coming around to facing death and pain and illness. I think it's in a way natural that at the beginning of your life, for rites of passage, to figure out where your direction is, and then at the end of life, for the same kind of thing, to figure out what you did do, and how you are going to manage this more difficult process of letting go and dying.
MAPS has the very strategic objective of getting psychedelics and marijuana legalized for medicinal usages. At the same time, there's other cultural vectors happening, like the massive ayahuasca movement worldwide, which I guess has it's a hands-on medicinal sort of component, but it's almost a religious or spiritual adjunct as well. How do you see those two streams of the outside community from MAPS doing the spiritual approach to psychedelics or entheogens, paralleling the medicinal stream?
Well, there's 3 tracks here at this conference. One is the science, and there's an entire track that's ayahuasca that just sort of emerged from this community. I think that there's political struggles related to religious freedom and human rights that make the argument that drugs should be legally available. And I think that's a bigger argument. It's really true, but it's harder to persuade people of the big picture initially. So the medicine and the research with the medical applications is the opening door. The society is more willing. We have the mechanisms through the FDA. We have the incredible need for treating PTSD from soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think for us still that our resources are focused on medical applications and then expanding legal context for use. I think the religious dimension and the religious freedom cases, the work that Roland Griffiths is doing with psilocybin and mystical experiences, that's extremely important. And we touch on that with working with people at the end of life, because that's often where a spiritual experience can help transform their perception of pain, their perception of anxiety, and also get them to work with their loved ones to say the things that need to be said and enrich the life that they still have. So the spirituality comes in more at the end of life than with MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think there are other groups that are really working a lot on the religious freedom. So Roy Haber is the attorney for the Santo Daime. He's here. He won a major religious freedom case. There's been the UDV that went to the Supreme Court. The Native American Church is legal to use peyote. So they can run concurrently, but I think in any movement you need some people that are doing this and some people are doing that. And the part where I see our maximum leverage is the medical applications.
What do you think? Like the whole thing with the 60s, just with LSD, seemed to become a threat to the establishment because it was unregulated. It was used, I guess, unwisely by the masses, en masse, in the face of the public, without a controlled setting in a way. But do you think that is there any danger with the psychedelics coming back into the medical fold that will pigeonhole them into that stream, but there's also going to be street use, and then there's all these other drugs being used on the street, but there's a thirst for tribal guidance in a way of how to use substances properly?
Yeah, well, I think when we look back at the 60s, I think it's a little bit too easy to say that the mass misuse is what led to the crackdown. And the follow-up study that I did to the Good Friday experiment that was done by Timothy Leary, who was the faculty sponsor in 1962, and it was about helping people who are religiously inclined to see if psilocybin would help them have mystical experiences. And
Walter Pankey,
yeah. And I did a follow-up study 25 years later, and I talked to the various people in the middle 80s. And what I learned from them is that they remembered their mystical experiences from psilocybin before. They still considered them valid. And they said that there was a link between the unitive sense of connection, a little bit of their loss of fear of death, a little bit of empowerment that led them to do work in social justice movements. Some talked about the civil rights movement, others talked about the environmental movement, some talked about the anti-war movement, the women's rights movement. So I think it's when psychedelics went right was the main reason that there was the crackdown. And the reason that psychedelics went wrong was kind of the excuse. We've got to protect these people who are having these bad experiences, killing themselves, going to hospital emergency rooms, and there was a lot of that. And at the same time, though, I think it was this association of people who were inspired by the sense of connection and the implications of that to challenge the status quo. And at the time, we had a very rigid political system with Nixon at the top. We had a culture that was just emerging from this highly repressed time. And also we had people who were part of this who had the belief that there is such a thing as a counterculture, that there is a way, that you can go away and create, a private utopia somewhere else. And so I think the main difference in the last 45 years, is that now we all realize there is no away. There is no place to run. How do you hide from global warming? How do you hide from nuclear annihilation? How do you, so I think that the direction of the rebels is more like, can we be scouts for a culture that appreciate us, going into the new ground, rather than being seen as threats to the culture because we're undermining these beliefs. And I think now we've got a big enough reservoir of people who are the culture, who were very involved in the 60s with the psychedelic community, who have found ways to live their lives where you can't tell, them from anybody else. And so we are this community, this perception is more integrated. And the other thing that has been incredibly encouraging, I thought for a long time that the interest in psychedelics might be just like a blip in this baby boomer group from the 60s, and that it failed and we were crushed, and then these younger generations would have something else, and that they would look at us as like, these silly old hippies are no longer relevant, and look, we have iPhones and we have all this technology, and so what has happened that I've been able to see over the last 5-10 years is really that the younger generations, in part through the rave movement, in other ways, that they are seeing the value here. It's not like this generation that is really isolated from the ones that went before and are coming after. So I feel much more relaxed now, and that's a big part of this idea of being patient, that we can't do it all in our own lifetimes, but that if it will be something that is shared down the generations.
What's your ultimate vision then for a psychedelic global culture?
Well, I would like us to be taken for granted. It's like when you look, most everybody here, all the women, I bet that very few of the women here think much about the suffragettes that got them the right to vote. I mean, women have only been voting for 80 years or so. And, it's like you grow up in a situation where you can vote, you just say, well, that's the way it's always been. So I think that this global spirituality, the United Religions, as a complement to the United Nations, and then also the recognition that people should have the human right to form their own religion. They don't need to be part of an organized group. That's part of the problem of these religious freedom cases, is that it's always as part of this group. And I think that deep spirituality begins with the individual, and you can find support with a group, but you have to be free to explore on your own. So ideally there would be networks of psychedelic clinics with specially trained therapists and physicians, and at the same time these clinics could be like rites of passage centers, like a driver's license test, where you go to a clinic, just as when you want to learn how to drive, you have to demonstrate you can drive to somebody who's going to take you out in a car, and it costs the society a little bit of money to have this kind of test. But so I think that if you're a young person, you go to these clinics, you have an experience under supervision, you don't have a panic reaction, then you get your little card and you can go do it on your own. And so that there would be more opportunities for people to have these individual experiences, and also more social context and more support if people wanted it that way.
Well, let's hope, hey?